All right, chapter 6 is the second chapter in unit 4 um, of government. We're going to go over, we just talked about political parties. Now we're going to talk about voters and voter behavior. Now, voters are part of one of the political parties, either the Democrats or Republicans. But as we see over the history of the United States, that the people who vote has changed significantly since the founding of the nation. So, throughout the U.S. history, voting was reserved for only a few select individuals, but this has slowly changed. In the early 1800s, states stopped requiring religious tests and property qualifications. That means if you weren't a God-fearing Christian, you couldn't vote, or if you didn't own property, you couldn't vote because you weren't like a real citizen. 1879, we get the 15th Amendment ends up passing. This is about 15 years, about 15 years following the end of the Civil War, and it would probably come about a little bit sooner, except some presidents were opposed to it. But the 15th Amendment gives all men the right to vote, regardless of race. Now, in reality, African Americans are still denied the right to vote in many states, especially in the South. There'd be something called a poll tax, where you'd have to pay $1 to vote. A lot of blacks couldn't do that in the South because they weren't earning enough money. There's a lot of African Americans who were illiterate or couldn't read, and there would be a literacy test before you could vote. So if you couldn't read, you couldn't vote. So there were ways that individual states in the South denied the right to vote to African Americans even after the passage of the 15th Amendment. Then we move on to 1920, where we pass the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote. Then you have the 1960s with the 23rd Amendment added. Voters from the District of Columbia as a separate presidential electorate, which basically just makes Washington, D.C. like its own state. I guess you can think of it that way anyway. Passing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 secured African Americans' right to vote. It made literacy tests and poll taxes illegal. In 1971, the 26th Amendment gets passed, making the minimum voting age 18 years old. Now, the Constitution allows each state to decide who can vote, but there are three aspects all states use. One, in order to vote, you need to be a United States citizen. Two, is based on your age. You have to be at least 18 years old to vote in each state. And finally, you have to have residence. States require that a person lives in a state for a certain number of days before they can vote in national and state elections. The number of days ranges between 10 and 50. The average is around 30 days, or about a month. So I can't vote in Illinois and then move to Wisconsin and vote again, you know? Yeah, otherwise I would be able to. I live in Illinois. I voted at 8 this morning, but at noon I moved to Wisconsin, so at 1 o'clock I could vote for the president again in Wisconsin. It doesn't work that way. You need to be there for a certain number of days. So who can be denied the right to vote? There's actually a handful of groups. No states allow people in mental institutions or people who are mentally incompetent to vote. Most states deny the right to vote to people who've been convicted of a serious crime. Just a little interesting fact, the word idiot comes from Greek, meaning those who do not take or did not take part in political life or vote. Major problem, um, one of the major problems occurring in the United States today is non-voting citizens. We actually have a lot of people who just don't vote because they don't think their vote doesn't count, or they don't trust the government, or they don't want to wait in lines, or they think that it's going to be bad weather, or they just don't have the time, or they just don't care. Um, a lot of people think that their vote doesn't count because the president is chosen by a series of electors that don't necessarily have to vote the same way the popular vote goes. Um, and people who feel this way, I think, have uh, a legitimate argument that their vote doesn't matter as much as it should vote as it should matter, because we don't have just a straight popular vote. We have a popular vote, and then we have an electoral vote. This is just a graph illustrating voter turnout in presidential and midterm elections. Generally, you're going to have a higher turnout in presidential elections than in midterm elections, because the presidential election is more advertised. You see the presidential debates on TV. And so, but what's interesting is you have a trend where people are voting more localized. They're more worried about local elections, okay, until the mid 1800s, when all of a sudden we have tension being created between the North and the South, which leads to the Civil War right around this time. But during that time, that's all of a sudden when people are like, well, we need to vote for the president, we need to vote for the nation as a whole. Before that, they were like, well, we're worried about who runs our state and who runs our local communities. And then after that, it becomes a little more focused on who the president is. Millions of Americans are complete idiots every year. It means a lot of people don't vote. Now let's look at statistics for voters. Voters versus non-voters. Voters, people who vote in presidential and midterm elections, tend to have higher levels of income, education, and occupational status. That means they're like doctors and lawyers. They have a high occupational status instead of like unskilled laborers, which are like people who work in retail or construction, things like that. So non-voters tend to be younger than 35. Voters tend to be really involved in the community. The voters generally live in urban areas, and they believe they can make a difference in politics. Non-voters are younger than 35, unskilled laborers, unmarried, they're more likely to live in rural areas, and they believe their actions don't really make a difference in politics. So here are turnout rates if you want to look at a table that illustrates what the 2 slides ago talked about. People 18 to 20, about 41% of people 18 to 20 show up. 21 to 24, about 42%, so that's still pretty low. 25 to 44, you got about a little over 50%. But then 65 and over, about 70% of people vote. High school diploma, or no high school diploma, only about 30% vote. High school, about 50% vote. With college, 75% of them vote. So on and so forth. Women tend to vote a little bit more than men, but it's pretty even. Why should I vote? The United States is a constitutional republic. It is founded on the idea that you vote. And so, therefore, it's the duty of every citizen to vote in both presidential and off-year elections. So, in democracy, one, a lot of people have fought for your right to vote. Two, democracy is based on the principle of participation. Without it, the system doesn't really work. And without your vote, people who don't represent you and aren't going to fight for your rights can remain in office or get into office. And these elected officials that we end up voting for are the people who make decisions that affect our everyday lives. When you turn 18, you need to register. You register for the draft and you register to vote. You can just do that at the DMV. You'll also receive a registration card in the mail that will allow you to vote. Then on voting day, all you got to do is you find the place in your district where people vote. In my neighborhood, it's at a church, and you just go in there, walk in, they give you a sheet of paper, you fill out your name and show an ID, and then you go to a individual booth and vote. Ballots are generally look like this. You just fill in bubbles, kind of like on a test, and then you just you go to a machine and you scan it through, and it tallies up the votes.